The Seed of Eternity, Osman and Early Ambitions. Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we embark on a journey through one of the most extraordinary stories in history, the slow collapse of the Ottoman Empire. For 6 centuries, this empire stretched across 3 continents, ruling millions of souls from the gates of Vienna to the sands of Yemen. It was an empire that called itself eternal, that believed it was chosen by God to rule until the end of days. But empires, like everything born of human ambition, carry within them the seeds of their own destruction. Tonight, we will explore how the Ottoman Empire, once the terror of Europe, the jewel of Islam, the bridge between East and West, slowly, inexorably crumbled into dust. So settle in, dim the lights, and let me tell you the story of how a 600-year reign ended. It is a story of dreams and nightmares, of glory and decay, of the eternal human struggle between what we aspire to be and what we inevitably become. Every empire begins with a dream, and the Ottoman Empire began with the dream of a man named Osman, a tribal chieftain in the hills of Anatolia in the late 13th century. The legend says that Osman once had a vision, a great tree growing from his chest, its branches spreading across the world, sheltering all humanity in its shade. Whether that vision was real or fabricated by later chroniclers is not important. What is important is that it captured something essential about the Ottoman spirit, a belief that they were destined not just to conquer, but to unite, to bring order to chaos, faith to the faithless, justice to the oppressed. In 1299, Osman declared independence from the dying Seljuk Sultanate. His followers were few, perhaps 1,000 warriors, maybe less. They controlled a small patch of land in northwest Anatolia, surrounded by enemies, the Byzantine Empire to the west, rivaled Turkish beyliks to the east, and a vast, indifferent world beyond. But the descendants of Osman had something their enemies lacked: a vision for the future. They didn't just want to raid and loot like many tribal confederations. They wanted to build something lasting, something eternal. The early Ottomans were pragmatists wrapped in the cloak of holy war. Yes, they fought in the name of Islam, but they welcomed Christian converts, adopted Byzantine administrative practices, and learned from everyone they conquered. They were synthesizers, borrowers, adapters. They took the best of every civilization they encountered and made it their own. This was their genius, and ultimately their tragedy. For in attempting to be everything to everyone, they would eventually become nothing to no one. By 1326, Osman's son Orhan had captured Bursa, making it the first true Ottoman capital. The city's thermal baths, its silk markets, its mosques and madrasas, all spoke of a new kind of Islamic state that valued commerce as much as conquest, scholarship as much as war. Orhan was the first Ottoman ruler to mint coins, to establish a standing army, and to institute the institutions that would outlast him. He married a Byzantine princess, Theodora, the daughter of Emperor John Kantakouzenos. It was a marriage that symbolized the Ottoman approach. They would not just destroy their enemies, they would absorb them, transform them, make them part of something greater. By 1354, they had crossed into Europe, establishing a foothold on the Gallipoli Peninsula. The Byzantines, desperate for allies in their endless civil wars, had effectively invited them across the Dardanelles to help fight their enemies. It was like inviting a wolf into your house to deal with a mouse infestation. The Ottomans never left. The move into Europe was more than a military maneuver. It was a psychological transformation. The Ottomans were no longer just another Anatolian beylik fighting over the remnants of the Seljuk legacy. They were now a European power, with European ambitions and European enemies. The land they entered was rich but chaotic. The Byzantine Empire was a shadow of its former self, controlling little more than Constantinople and a few scattered territories. The Balkans were a patchwork of Serbian despotates, Bulgarian tsars, and local chieftains, all fighting each other with the desperate fury of people who knew their world was ending. Into this chaos came the Ottomans, offering the one thing none of the local powers could provide: stability. They came not as destroyers, but as organizers. They offered lower taxes than the Byzantine Empire, religious tolerance, and most importantly, protection from the endless wars that had ravaged the region for generations. The Ottoman expansion into the Balkans was not a conquest in the traditional sense. It was more like a slow absorption, a gradual process where local elites found it more profitable to serve the Sultan than to fight him. Some, of course, resisted and were crushed, but many others simply switched allegiance, keeping their lands and titles in exchange for loyalty to the new order. This was the Ottoman way, to make resistance seem futile and cooperation advantageous. It was a strategy that would serve them for centuries, until it finally failed. The Janissary paradox, devshirme. What followed was a century of almost supernatural expansion. The Ottomans moved through the Balkans like a slow-burning fire, consuming everything in their path. But it was not mindless destruction. It was methodical, calculated, almost surgical in its precision. They understood what many conquerors never grasped, that lasting power comes not from fear alone, but from offering something better than what came before. To the Christian peasants of the Balkans, groaning under the weight of feudal oppression, the Ottomans offered lower taxes, religious tolerance, and social mobility. To ambitious young men, they offered the devshirme system, a chance to be taken from their families, converted to Islam, and trained to become the empire's elite administrators and soldiers. To a modern ear, this sounds horrific, and in many ways it was. The devshirme was a form of blood tax, a regular levy of Christian boys who were snatched from their families and forced to serve the state that had conquered them. Picture the scene. Ottoman officials arrive in a village, inspecting the boys like cattle, picking the strongest and most intelligent to be taken away forever. Parents wept, children screamed, and the officials wrote the names into their ledgers with the cold efficiency of bureaucrats. It was a system that violated every natural bond between parent and child, every human instinct to protect one's own. And yet, for a bright peasant boy in 14th century Serbia or Bulgaria, the devshirme could be the only route to power, wealth, and influence. The Ottoman system was brutal, but it was also meritocratic in a way that Christian Europe was not. The son of a shepherd from the mountains of Albania could rise to become Grand Vizier, the second most powerful man in the empire. A Greek fisherman could command armies and govern provinces. The Janissaries, the elite slave soldiers created through this system, became the backbone of Ottoman military might. They were celibate, disciplined, fanatically loyal to the Sultan. They lived in barracks, trained constantly, and knew no loyalty other than the empire that had created them. In many ways, they were the perfect soldiers. But they were also something more. They were the living embodiment of the Ottoman paradox. They were slaves who commanded free men, Christians who fought for Islam, foreigners who became more Ottoman than the Turks themselves. They represented everything brilliant and terrible about the Ottoman system. The Janissaries wore distinctive white felt caps, carried curved swords, and marched to the sound of military bands that struck terror into the hearts of their enemies. They were forbidden to marry, to own property, to have any loyalty but the Sultan. In return, they were given the best weapons, the best training, and the promise that they would share in the spoils of conquest. For 2 centuries, they were invincible. They broke the power of the Serbian nobles at Kosovo in 1389. They crushed the last crusade at Nicopolis in 1396. They reduced the Byzantine Empire to a tiny, isolated, and helpless state. But even in their moment of triumph, the seeds of future decline were already being sown. The Janissaries were becoming a privileged caste, more interested in protecting their own position than in serving the empire. The devshirme system was creating a ruling class that was increasingly detached from the Turkish population that had founded the empire. And the empire itself was becoming too large, too complex, too diverse to be governed by the simple methods that worked in the early days. Success was breeding the conditions for future failure. The tragedy of Kosovo and the invasion of Tamerlane. In 1389, at the Battle of Kosovo Polje, the Ottomans crushed a coalition of Serbian nobles. The battle has become legend. Prince Lazar choosing the heavenly kingdom over the earthly one, Miloš Obilić assassinating Sultan Murad in his tent. But legends don't change the outcome. Serbia fell, and with it, the last real obstacle to Ottoman dominance in the Balkans. The Battle of Kosovo was more than a military victory. It was a psychological watershed. For the Serbs, it became the defining moment of their national consciousness, the moment they chose martyrdom over submission. For the Ottomans, it was proof that God was on their side, that their empire was destined to rule the world. But the battle also revealed something troubling about the Ottoman system. Sultan Murad was indeed killed during the battle by a Serbian knight who feigned surrender. The fact that an enemy could get close enough to kill the Sultan suggested that the Ottoman court was becoming dangerously complacent, too confident in its own invincibility. Murad's son, Bayezid, who succeeded him, was nicknamed the Thunderbolt for the speed of his conquests. He completed the conquest of the Balkans, laid siege to Constantinople, and seemed poised to create a vast empire stretching from the Danube to the Euphrates. But Bayezid's ambitions brought him into conflict with another great conqueror, Tamerlane, the Mongol warlord who had carved out an empire stretching from India to the Mediterranean. In 1402, at the Battle of Ankara, Tamerlane crushed Bayezid's army and captured the Sultan himself. The defeat was catastrophic. Bayezid died in captivity, perhaps by suicide. The Ottoman Empire fell apart as his sons fought each other for the throne. For a moment, it seemed that the Ottoman dream might die with the great-great-grandson of its founder. But the empire survived, as it would survive many other crises over the centuries. Bayezid's son, Mehmed, emerged victorious from the civil war and began the process of rebuilding. The Ottomans had learned a valuable lesson. They were not invincible, and their enemies were not helpless. But they also learned that they were resilient, adaptive, capable of recovering from even the most devastating defeats. Constantinople still stood, the ancient city of Constantine, the last flickering ember of the Roman Empire. But it was now surrounded, cut off from the world, slowly suffocating in the Ottoman embrace. Its fall was no longer a question of if, but a question of when. For over 1,000 years, Constantinople had been the greatest city in the Christian world. Its walls had repelled Arabs, Bulgars, Russians, and countless other would-be conquerors. It was the city of the Hagia Sophia, of the great palace, of libraries that held the wisdom of ages. It was literally the last remnant of the Roman Empire. But by the 15th century, Constantinople was a shadow of its former self. A city that had once held 500,000 people now numbered perhaps 50,000. Entire districts lay in ruin, their houses collapsed, their streets overgrown with weeds. The imperial treasury was empty, the army was a joke, and the emperor ruled little more than the city itself and a few scattered islands. The great Theodosian walls that had protected Constantinople for 1,000 years were crumbling from neglect. The Golden Horn was silted up, its harbors empty of the merchant ships that had once brought wealth from all the known world. The Hagia Sophia itself, That marvel of Byzantine architecture was falling into disrepair, its mosaics dimmed, its dome cracked. And yet, Constantinople remained a symbol. As long as it stood, the Roman Empire, in some form, however diminished, still existed. As long as a Christian emperor sat on the throne of Constantine, the Muslim conquest of Europe remained incomplete. The last Caesar. The fall of Constantinople. The Great Cannon, nicknamed the Basilica by the Turks, could blast 20-foot-wide holes in the fortifications, but the defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew they were witnessing the end of the world. Constantine XI, the last of the Caesars, was ubiquitous during the siege. He walked the walls, encouraging his men, sharing their danger, refusing all Ottoman offers of surrender. He knew he was fighting not just for his city, but for his place in history. He would not be remembered as the emperor who gave up Constantinople without a fight. The siege was more than a military operation. It was a clash of civilizations, the final confrontation between the Christian and Islamic worlds. Both sides understood what was at stake. If Constantinople fell, it would be more than the end of the Byzantine Empire. It would be the end of an era. Mehmet tried every strategy he could devise. He built a pontoon bridge across the Golden Horn to attack the city from an unexpected direction. He dug tunnels under the walls, but his mines were discovered and destroyed by the defenders. He offered terms. The city could surrender and be spared, or it could fight and face the consequences. Constantine refused all offers. "It is not in my power," he said, "to surrender the city to you. The power belongs to God and my people to defend it." He would die as an emperor, not live as a vassal. The final assault began before dawn on May 29, 1453. The Janissaries poured through the breaches in the wall like a dark tide, their white caps gleaming in the pre-dawn light, their curved swords flashing. The defenders fought desperately, but were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese captain who had been the soul of the defense, was wounded and carried from the walls. His departure broke the defenders' morale. The Janissaries surged forward, climbing over the bodies of the dead, pouring into the city like water through a broken dam. Emperor Constantine XI, the last of the Caesars, stripped off his imperial regalia and died fighting in the streets as a common soldier. His body was never recovered, lost among the thousands of corpses that littered the city. When Mehmet entered the Hagia Sophia that day, he found it empty save for a few terrified priests. The great temple that had been the heart of Eastern Christianity for 900 years was silent. The mosaics of Christ and the Virgin Mary looked down upon the new master, a young sultan who had just achieved what no Muslim ruler before him had managed. Within hours, the church was consecrated as a mosque. The Christian symbols were plastered over. The altar was replaced with a mihrab pointing toward Mecca, and the call to prayer sounded where the divine liturgy had once been sung. The Roman Empire, which had lasted over 2,000 years in one form or another, was finally dead. In its place stood something new, the Ottoman Empire, master of 3 continents, heir to both Rome and Byzantium. But even in his moment of triumph, Mehmet must have felt the weight of what he had destroyed. Constantinople was more than just a city. It was a repository of human knowledge, a bridge between the ancient and medieval worlds, a symbol of continuity reaching back to the time of Christ. Now it was gone, and something irreplaceable was lost forever. The Ottomans had gained an empire, but the world had lost a piece of its soul. The Golden Age, Suleiman the Magnificent. What followed was the Ottoman Golden Age, a century and a half of expansion that seemed to know no bounds. Under Selim I, they conquered the Mamluk Sultanate, adding Egypt and the Levant to their domains. Under Suleiman the Magnificent, they pushed deep into Europe, laying siege to Vienna itself in 1529. At its peak, the Ottoman Empire stretched from the gates of Vienna to the Indian Ocean, from the Crimean Peninsula to the cataracts of the Nile. It controlled the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, making the Sultan the protector of Islam's most sacred sites. It commanded the trade routes between Europe and Asia, growing rich on the taxes levied on silk and spices. But even in its moment of greatest triumph, the empire was changing in ways that would prove fatal. The conquest of the Arab lands brought immense wealth, but it also brought new challenges. How do you govern an empire that spans 3 continents and includes dozens of different peoples, languages, and traditions? The Ottoman answer was the millet system, a form of religious autonomy that allowed Christians and Jews to self-govern in matters of personal law. It was tolerant by the standards of the age, but it also meant that the empire never truly integrated its diverse population. They remained separate communities, bound to the state by taxes and military service, but never truly Ottoman in their hearts. The millet system was both the empire's greatest strength and its greatest weakness. It allowed the Ottomans to rule an incredibly diverse population without the constant rebellions that plagued other empires. Christians could worship in their churches, Jews in their synagogues, each community following its own laws and customs. But it also meant that the empire was really a collection of separate societies, held together only by the person of the Sultan and the might of the state. There was no Ottoman nation, no shared identity that transcended religious boundaries. When that central authority began to weaken, nothing would remain to hold the empire together. What was even more dangerous was the change occurring at the center of power. The early Ottoman sultans were warriors, men who led their armies from the front and knew the empire intimately. Osman was a tribal chieftain, Orhan a city builder, Mehmet the conqueror, a young man obsessed with glory. But as the empire grew larger and more complex, the sultans retreated into the palace, surrounded by eunuchs, concubines, and courtiers. The Topkapi Palace in Istanbul became a world unto itself, a labyrinth of courtyards and chambers where the Sultan lived in magnificent isolation from his subjects. The harem, once a private household, became a political institution. The Sultan's mother, the Valide Sultan, often wielded more real power than the Grand Vizier. The Sultan's wives and concubines schemed and plotted, each trying to ensure that her son inherited the throne. Princes were no longer sent out to govern provinces where they could learn statecraft and military command. Instead, they were kept within the palace in luxurious apartments that were, in reality, gilded cages. They received education from eunuchs and tutors, but they had no real experience of the world they would one day rule. This was the beginning of what historians called the Sultanate of Women, a period when the empire was effectively run by the mothers, wives, and sisters of weak sultans. This was not necessarily worse than the rule of men. Some of these women were remarkably capable. Kösem Sultan, who dominated Ottoman politics for much of the 17th century, was a shrewd politician. But it represented a fundamental departure from the warrior ethos that had built the empire. The sultans were becoming figureheads, isolated from their subjects, dependent on others for information about their own domains.
Janissary self-interest and the threat of change. The Janissaries were also changing. Once celibate and disciplined, they now married, had children, and passed their positions on to their sons. They became a hereditary caste, more interested in protecting their privileges than in fighting the empire's enemies. They began to interfere in politics, overthrowing sultans who threatened their interests. In 1526, the Janissaries rioted against attempts by Sultan Selim I to reform the army. They surrounded the palace, demanded the Grand Vizier's resignation, and forced the Sultan to abandon his plans. This was a sign of things to come. The empire's own elite troops were becoming an obstacle to necessary change. The empire was becoming sclerotic, rigid, resistant to change. And change was coming whether they were ready for it or not. In the universities of Europe, scholars were making discoveries that were revolutionizing human understanding of the natural world. In the shipyards of Portugal and Spain, navigators were finding new routes to Asia that bypassed Ottoman territory entirely. The Ottomans, secure in their power and superiority, paid little attention to these developments. They had defeated every enemy, conquered every rival, amassed wealth beyond imagination. Why should they change a system that had brought them such success? But the world was shifting around them, and empires that cannot adapt are doomed to decline. The Ottoman Golden Age was ending, though few at the time realized it. The empire had reached its zenith, and there was only one way to go from there. The first sign that the Ottoman tide was turning came in 1683 at the Second Siege of Vienna. For 2 months, a massive Ottoman army, perhaps 200,000 strong, surrounded the city. It seemed like 1453 all over again, that the unstoppable Ottoman war machine would finally break into the heart of Europe. The Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa Pasha, had convinced Sultan Mehmed IV that Vienna was ripe for the taking. The Holy Roman Empire was distracted by wars with France. The Austrians were weak, and the city's defenses were outdated. It would be, he promised, an easy victory that would open the road to Rome itself. But this time, things were different. The Austrians held firm, supported by Polish cavalry under the command of King Jan Sobieski. The siege dragged on through the summer, the Ottomans slowly tunneling toward the city walls, while the defenders grew more desperate by the day. Inside Vienna, the situation was becoming critical. Food supplies were running low, disease was rampant, and the city walls were beginning to crumble under the constant bombardment. On September 12, 1683, the biggest cavalry charge in history was launched. 18,000 horsemen swept down from the hills around Vienna like an avalanche of steel and horseflesh. The Ottoman lines, weakened by months of siege warfare and overconfident in their superiority, shattered like glass. The Janissaries, who had seemed invincible for 2 centuries, broke and ran. The Grand Vizier fled the field, abandoning his tent, his treasures, and his reputation. The siege collapsed in a matter of hours. The Ottoman army fled in panic, leaving behind their cannons, their supplies, and their dreams of European conquest. King Sobieski entered Vienna in triumph, and the legend is that he sent a message to the Pope, paraphrasing Caesar, Veni, vidi, Deus vicit. I came, I saw, God conquered. It was more than a military defeat. It was a psychological turning point. For 2 centuries, the Ottomans had seemed inconquerable, the scourge of Christendom, the sword of Islam. Now they suddenly looked mortal. The defeat at Vienna shattered the myth of Ottoman invincibility, the crisis of trade and technology. What followed was a string of defeats. The Holy League, Austria, Poland, Venice, and Russia chipped away at Ottoman territories in the Balkans. Prince Eugene of Savoy, a brilliant Austrian general, won victory after victory against Ottoman forces that seemed to have lost their fighting spirit. The Ottomans, who had once been masters of siege warfare, now found themselves on the defensive. Their fortresses fell one by one: Belgrade, Buda, Novi Sad. The empire that had once relentlessly expanded was now contracting, losing territory for the first time in its history. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 forced the Ottomans to cede Hungary, Transylvania, and much of their Balkan conquests. For the first time in their history, the Ottomans had to give up significant territory in a peace treaty. An empire that had never known defeat was tasting the bitter flavor of humiliation. But the real crisis was not military. It was economic and technological. While the Ottomans were focused on conquest and administration, Western Europe was undergoing a revolution. The scientific revolution, the age of exploration, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. All of this passed the Ottoman Empire by. The discovery of sea routes to Asia around the Cape of Good Hope devastated Ottoman trade revenues. Why pay Ottoman taxes for silk and spices when you could sail directly to India and China? The empire's economy, built on control of the trade routes between Europe and Asia, began to collapse. Portuguese and Dutch ships were now carrying the goods that had once made Ottoman merchants rich. The empire's great trading cities, Aleppo, Damascus, Cairo, began to decline as commerce shifted to the Atlantic routes. The empire's tax revenues plummeted, making it difficult to maintain the armies and bureaucracy that held the state together. Meanwhile, European military technology was advancing rapidly. The Ottomans had once been innovators. They were among the first to use cannons effectively in siege warfare. But by the 18th century, they were falling behind. Their armies still relied on tactics and weapons that were state-of-the-art 2 centuries earlier. European armies were becoming more professional, better trained, and better equipped. They had standardized weapons, unified drill, and officers trained in military academies. The Ottoman military, by contrast, was still largely feudal, reliant on irregular troops and outdated equipment. The empire's financial system was outdated. While European states developed sophisticated banking systems and national debts, the Ottomans still relied on tax farming, selling the right to collect taxes to the highest bidder. This was a system that encouraged corruption and short-term thinking. The tax farmers had no incentive to develop the regions they controlled or to invest in long-term improvements. They simply squeezed as much money as possible out of the peasants during their tenure and then moved on. The result was economic stagnation and increasing resentment among the empire's subjects. Ideological decay and the long decline. Most dangerously of all, the empire was losing its ideological integrity. The early Ottomans were driven by a sense of mission to spread Islam, to bring justice to the world, to fulfill God's design for humanity. But by the 18th century, that sense of mission was fading. The empire was becoming just another state, preoccupied with survival rather than transformation. The sultans were no longer warrior kings leading holy wars, but palace autocrats, more interested in their own comfort than in the welfare of their subjects. The Ottoman Empire was entering what historians call the long decline, a period of military defeats, economic stagnation, and political decay that would last for over 2 centuries. The empire would survive, but it would never again be the dominant power it once was. By the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire had acquired a new nickname in European diplomatic circles, the sick man of Europe. It was a cruel but not inaccurate description. The empire was clearly in decline, losing territory to Russia in the north, struggling with rebellions in the Balkans, and falling further behind Europe economically and technologically. The phrase was supposedly coined by Tsar Nicholas I of Russia, who told the British ambassador in 1853, "We have on our hands a sick man, a very sick man." The Tsar was proposing that Britain and Russia divide the Ottoman Empire between them. Nonetheless, the Ottomans were not passive victims of their decline. Throughout the 19th century, a series of reform-minded sultans and administrators attempted to modernize the empire, to adapt it to the realities of the modern world. These efforts, known collectively as the Tanzimat, or reorganization, represented one of the most ambitious attempts at reform in history. The need for reform was obvious. The empire had suffered a series of humiliating defeats at the hands of Russia, losing Crimea in 1783 and much of the northern Black Sea coast in subsequent wars. The Janissaries had become a reactionary force, opposing all attempts at military modernization and often overthrowing sultans who threatened their privileges. The empire's finances were in chaos. The traditional system of tax farming had collapsed, leaving the central government chronically short of revenue. The army was outdated, the bureaucracy was corrupt, and the empire's Christian subjects were growing increasingly restive. Sultan Mahmud II, who reigned from 1808 to 1839, was perhaps the most radical reformer. He understood that the empire could not survive without fundamental change and was willing to use extreme measures to achieve it. In 1826, he took the decisive step. He destroyed the Janissaries. The elite corps that had once been the bedrock of Ottoman power had become a reactionary force, opposing all attempts at military modernization. They overthrew sultans, interfered in politics, and turned their barracks into centers of mutiny. He lured them into their barracks in Istanbul and ordered them to be wiped out by artillery fire. It was brutal, but it cleared the path for the creation of a modern army. The event became known as the Auspicious Incident, a euphemism that barely concealed the horror of what took place. Thousands of Janissaries died in the bombardment, their barracks reduced to rubble, their centuries-old traditions wiped out in a single morning. It was the end of an era, a definitive break with the military system that had built the empire. The promise of equality. But Mahmud's reforms went far beyond military matters. He opened new schools, built roads and telegraph lines, and began the process of creating a modern bureaucracy. He permitted his subjects to dress in European fashions, breaking down the rigid dress codes that separated Muslims from Christians, officials from commoners. The subsequent Tanzimat reforms were even more sweeping. They established equality before the law for all Ottoman subjects, regardless of religion. They created a modern education system, built railroads and telegraph lines, and attempted to forge a sense of Ottoman citizenship that transcended religious and ethnic divisions. The Het-i-Sherif of Gulhane, issued in 1839, promised that all Ottoman subjects would enjoy security of life, honor, and property. It abolished tax farming, established regular salaries for government officials, and promised fair and public trials for all accused of crimes. The Het-i-Humayun of 1856 went even further, promising complete equality between Muslims and non-Muslims. Christians and Jews could now serve in the army, hold government office, and testify in court on equal terms with Muslims. It was a revolutionary change in a society that had been based on religious hierarchy for centuries. But the reforms faced enormous obstacles. Conservative religious authorities opposed changes that seemed to undermine Islamic law. The ulema, the class of Islamic scholars and judges, saw the reforms as an infringement on their authority and the divine order of society. Ethnic minorities, especially in the Balkans, were more interested in independence than in Ottoman citizenship. The Greeks had already won their independence in the 1820s, and other Christian peoples were beginning to dream of following suit. And the European powers, despite their rhetoric about reform, often preferred a weak Ottoman Empire they could manipulate. They were happy to see the Ottomans modernize their army, but they were not interested in seeing the empire become strong enough to challenge their own interests in the region. The Greek War of Independence, which began in 1821, was a harbinger of things to come. The Greeks, inspired by European nationalism and supported by Britain, France, and Russia, fought for 8 years to break away from Ottoman rule. The war was brutal, marked by massacres on both sides. The Ottomans hanged the Greek Patriarch of Constantinople in retaliation for the revolt, while Greek rebels murdered Turkish civilians in the Peloponnese. It was a preview of the ethnic conflicts that would tear the empire apart in the coming century. The war ended with Greek independence in 1830, but not before it demonstrated the empire's weakness. The Ottomans were unable to suppress the revolt on their own, and were forced to call on their Egyptian vassal, Muhammad Ali, for help. Even then, they were only defeated by the intervention of the European powers. More revolts followed. Serbia gained autonomy in 1817 and full independence in 1878. Romania, Bulgaria, Montenegro. One by one, the European provinces of the Ottoman Empire broke away. Each loss weakened the empire further, both economically and psychologically. Financial collapse and the Young Turks. The Crimean War of 1854 to 1856 provided a brief respite. Britain and France, worried about Russian expansion, allied with the Ottomans against their traditional enemy. The war was a disaster for all involved. Hundreds of thousands died from disease and incompetence, but it halted Russian expansion for a generation. Even this victory, however, came at a cost. The war left the Ottoman Empire deeply indebted to European banks. By 1875, the empire was spending over half its budget on debt servicing. In 1876, it declared bankruptcy, and European creditors took control of Ottoman finances through the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. The empire was becoming a semi-colony, nominally independent, but economically controlled by foreign powers. It was a humiliating position for a state that had once been the terror of Europe. The reforms of the Tanzimat period were impressive in their scope and ambition, but they came too late and faced too much resistance to save the empire. The Ottoman state was like a patient undergoing surgery while still fighting a war. The operation may have been necessary, but the timing was disastrous. By the late 19th century, a new generation of Ottoman intellectuals and officers began to organize in secret. They called themselves the Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, but history knows them as the Young Turks. They were educated, westernized, and profoundly frustrated by the empire's decline. These young men had grown up watching their empire lose war after war, territory after territory, prestige after prestige. They saw the European powers carving up Ottoman lands, while the Sultan and his ministers seemed powerless to stop them. The Young Turks believed that the empire could be saved, but only through radical transformation. They wanted to create a modern, centralized state based on Ottoman nationalism rather than Islamic identity. They wanted to industrialize the economy, modernize the army, and create a sense of shared citizenship among all the peoples of the empire. Their intellectual leader was a man named Ahmed Riza, who studied in Paris and absorbed the ideas of French positivism. He believed that the empire's problems could be solved by applying scientific principles to governance and society. Progress, he argued, was not just possible, but inevitable, provided the empire could free itself from the dead grip of tradition and superstition. But the Young Turks were not just intellectuals, they were also conspirators. They organized in secret cells, communicated in code, and planned for the day they could seize power and implement their vision of reform. Their opportunity came in 1908 when a group of Young Turk officers in Macedonia started a revolt against Sultan Abdul Hamid II. The Sultan, faced with the choice between civil war and capitulation, chose to restore the constitution he had suspended 30 years earlier. For a brief moment, it seemed that the empire might be reborn. Christians and Muslims celebrated together in the streets of Istanbul. Parliament reconvened after decades of dormancy. There was talk of a new Ottoman identity that would unite all the peoples of the empire, Turks, Arabs, Armenians, Greeks, Jews, under one flag. The Young Turk Revolution was met with euphoria across the empire. In Salonika, the birthplace of the movement, crowds gathered in the streets chanting liberty, equality, fraternity. But the euphoria was short-lived. The Young Turk Revolution unleashed forces that proved impossible to control. Bulgaria declared full independence, taking advantage of the chaos to break away completely from Ottoman suzerainty. Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina, territories it had occupied since 1878. Crete declared its union with Greece, despite Ottoman protests. The empire's enemies, sensing weakness, moved quickly to grab what they could. In a matter of months, the Ottomans lost more territory than they had in the previous century. The revolution that was meant to save the empire seemed to be accelerating its collapse. Worse, the Young Turks' vision of Ottoman nationalism proved to be a fantasy. The empire's Christian minorities were not interested in becoming Ottoman patriots. Internal discord and the policy of Turkification. Internal discord and the policy of Turkification, they had their own national movements, their own dreams of independence. The Greeks wanted to unite with Greece, the Bulgarians with Bulgaria, the Serbians with Serbia, and the Muslim populations of the empire, Arabs, Kurds, Albanians, were developing their own nationalist movements. The Arabs, who made up perhaps 40% of the empire's population, were beginning to dream of an independent Arab state. The Kurds, scattered across the empire's eastern provinces, were developing their own sense of national identity. The Young Turks responded to these challenges with increasing authoritarianism. They centralized power in Istanbul, suppressed minority languages, and attempted to impose Turkish culture on the empire's diverse population. The very reforms designed to save the empire were tearing it apart. The policy of Turkification was particularly disastrous. The Young Turks believed that the empire could only survive if all its peoples became Turkish in language and culture. They closed minority schools, banned minority newspapers, and forced civil servants to speak Turkish. But this policy only alienated the non-Turkish populations of the empire. The Arabs, who had been relatively loyal to the Ottoman state, began to organize their own nationalist movements. The Armenians, who had hoped the Young Turk Revolution would bring them equality and security, found themselves increasingly persecuted. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 were the final blow to Ottoman Europe. A coalition of Balkan states, Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, and Montenegro, attacked the empire and drove it out of Europe almost entirely. The First Balkan War began in October 1912 when Montenegro declared war on the Ottoman Empire. Within days, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Greece joined the attack. The Ottoman forces, demoralized and poorly led, collapsed almost immediately. In just 2 months, the Balkan allies conquered almost all of the empire's remaining European territory. Adrianople, the ancient Ottoman capital, fell to the Bulgarians. Salonika, the birthplace of the Young Turk movement, was occupied by the Greeks. The empire that had once laid siege to Vienna was now reduced to a small beachhead around Istanbul. The Second Balkan War, which occurred in 1913, saw the Balkan allies turn on each other over the division of the spoils. The Ottomans managed to retake Adrianople, but this was small consolation for the loss of most of their European empire. In just 2 years, the Ottomans lost 80% of their European territory and 70% of their European population. The psychological impact was devastating. For 6 centuries, the Ottomans had been a European power. Now they were an Asian state with European pretensions. The empire that had once stretched from the gates of Vienna to the Indian Ocean was now reduced to Anatolia, the Arab provinces, and a tiny foothold in Europe. The Young Turks, who had promised to save the empire, presided over its greatest territorial losses since its founding.
The fatal gamble, World War I. The Young Turks, desperate to reverse the empire's fortunes, began searching for allies, and in 1914 they found one in Germany, another empire that felt encircled and threatened by its enemies. When World War I began in July 1914, the Ottoman Empire faced a terrible choice. They could remain neutral and hope to survive the conflict unscathed, or they could choose a side and risk everything on the outcome. The empire was in no condition to fight a world war. The Balkan Wars had left it exhausted and demoralized. The army was poorly equipped and trained. The treasury was empty, and the government was divided among competing factions. But the Young Turk leadership, dominated by the triumvirate of Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Jamal Pasha, decided to gamble. In November 1914, they entered the war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary, hoping that a Central Powers victory would restore the empire's lost territory and prestige. It was a decision born of desperation and delusion. Enver Pasha, the de facto leader of the empire, was convinced that Germany would win quickly and that the Ottomans would share the spoils. He dreamed of a new Ottoman Empire stretching from the Balkans to Central Asia, uniting all Turkic peoples under Ottoman rule. Enver was a man intoxicated by his own ambition. But Enver's dreams were built on sand. The Ottoman Empire was not the great power it once was. Its army was a shadow of the force that had once terrorized Europe. Its economy was reliant on foreign loans. Its population was war-weary and increasingly disloyal. Reality was very different from Enver's fantasies. The war was a catastrophe for the Ottoman Empire from the start. Enver's attempt to invade Russia in the Caucasus ended in disaster at the Battle of Sarikamish, where an entire Ottoman army was wiped out by Cold and the Russians. The campaign began in December 1914, when Enver personally led an army of 90,000 men into the mountains of eastern Anatolia in the middle of winter. It was an act of madness. The troops were ill-equipped for winter warfare. Supply lines were inadequate, and the Russians were well prepared for the attack. Of the 90,000 men who started the campaign, fewer than 10,000 returned. The others died of cold, starvation, disease, or Russian bullets. Entire regiments simply disappeared in the snow. Their bodies were not found until spring. It was one of the most complete military disasters in history. The defeat at Sarikamish had ramifications far beyond the immediate military losses. It convinced the Young Turk leadership that the empire's Armenian population was collaborating with the Russians, setting the stage for the genocide that would follow. Meanwhile, the British and French began their own offensive against the empire. The Gallipoli campaign of 1915 was intended to knock the Ottomans out of the war quickly by capturing Istanbul and opening a supply route to Russia. The campaign began with a naval attack on the Dardanelles in March 1915. British and French warships attempted to force their way through the straits, but were repulsed by Ottoman mines and shore batteries. Several ships were sunk, and the naval attack was abandoned. The Allies then decided on a land invasion. On April 25, 1915, British, French, Australian, and New Zealand forces landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula. They expected to sweep aside the Ottoman defenders and march on Istanbul within days. But the Ottomans, led by a young colonel named Mustafa Kemal, fought with desperate courage. The invaders were pinned down on the beaches, unable to advance more than a few miles inland. What was meant to be a quick victory turned into a bloody stalemate. The Gallipoli campaign lasted 8 months and cost both sides massive casualties. The Ottomans lost over 200,000 men defending the peninsula, but they held. The Allies, having suffered similar losses, finally evacuated in January 1916. The victory at Gallipoli was one of the few bright spots in the Ottoman war effort. It made Mustafa Kemal a national hero,
and proved that the empire could still fight when its back was against the wall. But it was a defensive victory, and the empire needed offensive successes to have any hope of winning the war.
The Arab Revolt and the genocide. Even more destructive than the military defeats was the Arab Revolt that began in 1916. Sharif Hussein ibn Ali of Mecca proclaimed Arab independence and began a guerrilla war against Ottoman rule. The revolt was encouraged and supported by the British, who saw it as a way to weaken the Ottoman Empire from within. British agents, including the famous T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, supplied the Arab rebels with weapons, money, and military advice. The Arab Revolt was a crushing blow to Ottoman morale. The Arabs had been among the empire's most loyal subjects, and their rebellion seemed to prove that the Ottoman ideal of unity and diversity was dead. If the Arabs, who shared the same religion as the Turks, could revolt, what hope was there for holding the empire together? The revolt also had severe strategic consequences. It diverted thousands of Ottoman troops that were desperately needed on other fronts. It severed the empire's link to its Arab provinces, cutting off vital sources of revenue and manpower. But the greatest tragedy of the war was the Armenian genocide. Convinced that the empire's Armenian population was collaborating with the Russians, the Young Turk government ordered the deportation of Armenians from eastern Anatolia in April 1915. Systematic mass murder followed. Over 1 million Armenians died in what became one of the first genocides of the 20th century. Men were shot. Women and children were driven into the desert to die of thirst and starvation, and entire communities were wiped out. The genocide was not only a moral catastrophe, it was also a strategic disaster. The Armenians were among the empire's most educated and economically productive citizens. They were the merchants, the artisans, the professionals, the backbone of the empire's middle class. Their destruction weakened the empire at the very moment it needed all its strength. The genocide also damaged the empire's international reputation. Reports of the massacres reached the outside world, turning public opinion against the Ottomans and making it difficult for Germany to justify its alliance with them. By 1918, the Ottoman Empire was collapsing on all fronts. In Palestine, British forces under General Edmund Allenby had captured Jerusalem and were advancing toward Damascus. In Mesopotamia, British and Indian troops had occupied Baghdad and were pushing north toward Mosul. In the Caucasus, the Russians had been replaced by the British, who supported Armenian and Georgian independence. The empire's economy had collapsed. Inflation was rampant, food was scarce, and the government was printing money to pay its bills. The population was starving, disease was spreading, and desertion from the army was becoming epidemic. In October 1918, the empire signed an armistice with the Allies, effectively ending its participation in the war. The terms were harsh. The Allies would occupy the straits, the army would be demobilized, and the empire would surrender its remaining territories in the Arab world. The 600-year-old empire had staked everything on one last throw of the dice and lost it all. The end of World War I brought not peace, but partition. The victorious Allies, Britain, France, Italy, and Greece, descended upon the Ottoman Empire like vultures on a carcass, each determined to carve out its share of the spoils. The Treaty of Sèvres, signed in August 1920, was intended to be the Ottoman Empire's death warrant. It reduced the empire to a small rump state in central Anatolia, surrounded by hostile neighbors and dependent on the Allies' goodwill for its very survival. Under the terms of the treaty, the straits were to be internationalized and placed under Allied control. Armenia was to become an independent state in eastern Anatolia. Kurdistan was to be granted autonomy with the possibility of full independence if the League of Nations approved.
The Arab provinces were to be divided between Britain and France as League of Nations mandates. Most humiliating of all, Greece was awarded large portions of western Anatolia, including the great city of Izmir. Greek armies landed in May 1919 and began to push inland, dreaming of recreating the Byzantine Empire and realizing the great idea of uniting all Greeks under one flag. The Greek occupation was particularly painful for the Turks. The Greeks were not just foreign invaders, they were former subjects of the empire, Christians who had lived under Ottoman rule for centuries. Their occupation of Turkish land seemed to symbolize the complete reversal of fortune that had befallen the empire. The treaty also imposed severe restrictions on the Turkish military. The army was limited to 50,000 men, the navy to a few small vessels, and an air force was completely forbidden. Turkey would be defenseless, reliant on the Allies for protection from its enemies. The Revolt of Anatolia. Mustafa Kemal. Financially, the Sevres Treaty was just as devastating. Turkey was to pay massive reparations to the Allies, and its finances were to be controlled by an international commission. The Ottoman Public Debt Administration, which already controlled much of the empire's revenue, was to be expanded and given even greater powers. It seemed like the end of the story. The Ottoman Empire, which had once ruled 3 continents, was being torn apart by its enemies like a defeated animal. Sultan Mehmed VI was a powerless figurehead, dependent on Allied protection for his very survival. But the Allies made a crucial miscalculation. They assumed that the Turkish people, exhausted by years of war and defeat, would passively accept the partition. They forgot that the Turks, whatever their other faults, were never a people who quietly submit to foreign domination. In the ruins of the empire, a new leader was emerging. Mustafa Kemal, the hero of Gallipoli. Unlike the discredited young Turk leadership, Kemal had a clear vision for the future. He would build a new Turkish state from the ashes of the Ottoman Empire, a state that would be modern, secular, and nationalistic. Kemal understood what the Allies did not, that the age of empires was ending. The future belonged to nation-states, not multi-ethnic empires. By embracing Turkish nationalism and abandoning the Ottoman dream of a universal empire, he could mobilize an energy that the old regime never could have harnessed. In May 1919, Kemal landed at the Black Sea port of Samsun with a small band of followers. Officially, he was there to oversee the demobilization of Ottoman forces in accordance with the armistice terms. In reality, he was starting a revolution that would transform the Middle East. The Turkish War of Independence that followed was one of the most remarkable military and political achievements of the 20th century. Against overwhelming odds, Kemal and his followers raised a new army, established a new government in Ankara, and began to fight back against the occupying powers. The war was brutal and desperate. The Greeks advanced deep into Anatolia, coming within 50 miles of Ankara. The French occupied southern Turkey, the Italians held the southwest, and the British controlled the Straits and Istanbul. It seemed impossible that the Turkish resistance could succeed. But Kemal had several advantages that his enemies underestimated. He was fighting on his home soil with the support of the Turkish population. He was a brilliant military strategist and an even brilliant politician. And his enemies were divided, each pursuing their own agenda rather than working together effectively. Most importantly, Kemal understood the power of nationalism in the modern world. He was not trying to restore the Ottoman Empire. He was creating something entirely new. The Turkish national movement was not burdened by the empire's legacy of defeat and decline. It was a fresh start, a chance to build a modern state from the ground up. The war raged for 3 years, from 1919 to 1922. There were moments when the Turkish cause seemed hopeless, when Greek armies were at the gates of Ankara and the government prepared to flee into the interior. But Kemal never lost faith in ultimate victory. He understood that this was not just a war for territory, it was a war for the soul of the Turkish people. Either they would win their independence and establish a modern nation-state, or they would vanish from history as a free people. The turning point came in August 1922 at the Battle of Dumlupinar. Kemal's forces, now calling themselves the Turkish National Army, launched a massive offensive against the Greek forces in western Anatolia. In just 11 days, they shattered the Greek army and sent it fleeing toward the sea. The Greek retreat turned into a rout and then a catastrophe. Entire Greek divisions disintegrated under the Turkish onslaught. Officers abandoned their men, soldiers threw away their weapons, and the dream of a great Greece died in the dust of Anatolia. The civilian Greek population of western Anatolia, terrified of Turkish reprisals, fled with the army. Hundreds of thousands of people, men, women, and children who had lived in Anatolia for generations, abandoned their homes and possessions and headed for the coast, hoping to find ships to carry them to safety. The Great Fire of Izmir in September 1922 marked the end of the Greek presence in Asia Minor after nearly 3,000 years. The city burned for days, destroying the Greek and Armenian quarters and erasing centuries of multicultural history. Whether the fire was deliberate or started accidentally remains a matter of dispute. The Turks blamed the retreating Greek soldiers, the Greeks blamed Turkish irregulars, and neutral observers were divided. But the result was the same. The cosmopolitan city that had been a symbol of Ottoman diversity was reduced to ashes. The birth of Turkey, Ataturk, and the secular reforms. By the end of 1922, the Turkish forces had driven out all foreign armies from Anatolia. The Sèvres Treaty was dead, replaced by the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, which recognized the independence and territorial integrity of the new Turkish state. The Treaty of Lausanne was a remarkable diplomatic achievement for the Turks. They had managed to overturn a dictated peace by military force and replace it with a negotiated settlement that recognized their core demands. Under the new treaty, Turkey became a sovereign state with secure borders. The straits remained under Turkish control, though they were to be demilitarized and open to international shipping. The capitulations, the system of extraterritorial rights that gave foreign powers special privileges in the Ottoman Empire, were abolished. Most importantly, the treaty included a massive population exchange between Turkey and Greece. Over 1 million Greeks were to be expelled from Turkey, while nearly 400,000 Turks were to be forced to leave Greece. It was ethnic cleansing on mass scale, but it was framed as a humanitarian measure to prevent future conflict. But Kemal's revolution went far beyond military victory and diplomatic success. In November 1922, he abolished the Sultanate, ending 6 centuries of Ottoman rule. The last Sultan, Mehmed VI, fled Istanbul aboard a British warship, carrying away the remnants of a dynasty that had once ruled half the known world. The abolition of the Sultanate was more than a political change. It was a symbolic break with the past. The Ottoman Empire was built around the person of the Sultan, who was both the political ruler and the religious leader of the Muslim community. By abolishing the Sultanate, Kemal declared that the new Turkey would be based on fundamentally different principles. In October 1923, Kemal proclaimed the Turkish Republic, with himself as its first president. The transformation was complete. The Ottoman Empire was dead, and in its place stood something entirely new, a modern, secular, nationalist state. Kemal, who would later take the surname Ataturk, father of the Turks, set about remaking Turkish society from the top down. He abolished the caliphate in 1924, severing the last link to the empire's Islamic identity. He replaced Islamic law with European legal codes, gave women the right to vote, and encouraged them to participate in public life. He replaced the Arabic alphabet with the Latin script, cutting off the new generation from their Ottoman past. He moved the capital from Istanbul to Ankara, from a cosmopolitan imperial city to a small town in the Anatolian heartland. He banned the fez and encouraged Western dress, even personally demonstrating how to wear a hat. Most symbolically of all, he changed the call to prayer from Arabic to Turkish, forcing Islam itself to serve the cause of Turkish nationalism. It was a radical transformation that would have been unthinkable within the Ottoman system. The legacy of collapse and the Middle East. The transformation was remarkable, but it came at a cost. The new Turkey was ethnically homogeneous in a way the Ottoman Empire never was. The Greek population was gone, expelled in the population exchange. The Armenians were gone, victims of genocide and deportation. The Kurds were denied recognition as a separate people and forced to assimilate into Turkish culture. The Ottoman dream of unity and diversity was replaced by the modern nightmare of ethnic nationalism. It was a pattern that would be repeated throughout the former Ottoman lands, from the Balkans to the Middle East. But for the Turks themselves, the transformation was liberating. They had shed the burden of empire, the responsibility of governing diverse populations with conflicting interests. They could focus on building a modern nation-state, on creating prosperity and security for their own people. The Turkish Republic that rose from the ashes of the Ottoman Empire was not perfect, but it was viable. It survived the challenges of the interwar period, remained neutral for much of World War II, and eventually became a member of NATO and a candidate for the European Union. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk achieved what few leaders in history have managed. He created a new nation from the ruins of an old empire. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire did not end with the proclamation of the Turkish Republic. Its consequences rippled outward like waves from a stone dropped in quiet water, shaping the modern Middle East and Balkans in ways that are still felt today. The empire's Arab provinces were divided between Britain and France as League of Nations mandates, a polite fiction that masked old-fashioned colonialism. The British took Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan, while the French took Syria and Lebanon. These artificial borders, drawn by European diplomats with little understanding of local conditions, would become sources of conflict for generations. The mandate system was supposed to be temporary, a way to prepare the Arab peoples for eventual independence. But in practice, it was a way for European powers to control the oil resources and strategic positions of the Middle East without the cost and responsibility of formal colonization. In Palestine, the British made contradictory promises to both Arabs and Jews during the war. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 promised a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. At the same time, the British had promised Arab independence in exchange for their support against the Ottomans. The result was a century-long conflict that continues to this day. The British found themselves caught between competing nationalisms, unable to satisfy either side. Jewish immigration increased throughout the 1920s and 30s, leading to rising tensions with the Arab population. The British tried to restrict immigration, which angered the Jews, and then allowed it to continue, which angered the Arabs. The partition of Palestine in 1947 and the creation of Israel in 1948 were direct consequences of the Ottoman Empire's collapse and the subsequent British mandate. The conflict between Israelis and Palestinians is in many ways a continuation of the struggle for the Ottoman legacy. In Iraq, the British stitched together three Ottoman provinces, Baghdad, Basra, and Mosul, into a single state that has struggled with internal divisions ever since. Sunni Arabs, who had dominated the Ottoman administration, found themselves ruling over a Shiite Arab majority and a Kurdish minority, both of whom had their own grievances and aspirations. The artificial nature of Iraq's borders became apparent almost immediately. The Kurds rebelled in the 1920s, the Shiites mounted repeated uprisings, and the country never achieved the stability and unity its creators envisioned. The American invasion of 2003 and the chaos that followed can be traced back to the fundamental contradictions engineered into Iraq at its creation. Syria and Lebanon, under French mandate, faced similar problems. The French divided Syria into several smaller states based on religious and ethnic lines, attempting to apply the old Ottoman millet system to modern nationalism. But the artificial divisions only created more problems, and Syria has struggled with sectarian conflict ever since. Lebanon, carved out of Syria to create a Christian majority state, has been torn apart by civil wars and foreign interventions. The fragile balance between Christians and Muslims that the French tried to create has been repeatedly ruptured, leading to decades of instability and violence. The Balkans also bore the scars of the Ottoman collapse. The new state of Yugoslavia attempted to unite the South Slavs who had been divided by centuries of Ottoman and Austrian rule, but the ethnic and religious divides were too deep. The memories of past conflicts were too fresh. Yugoslavia managed to hold together for most of the 20th century, first under royal rule and then under communist dictatorship. But when the Cold War ended and the communist system collapsed, the old divisions erupted with renewed fury. The Yugoslav wars of the 1990s were, in many ways, a continuation of the conflicts that began with the Ottoman retreat from the Balkans. Serbs, Croats, Bosnians, and Albanians fought with a ferocity that shocked the world. But the roots of their hatred lay deep in the Ottoman past. The very concept of ethnic cleansing, which became notorious during the Yugoslav wars, was not new. It was practiced during the Ottoman collapse, when Greeks and Turks were forcibly exchanged, when Armenians were deported and murdered, when entire populations were uprooted and resettled. The challenges of Turkey and the psychological vacuum. Even Turkey, the most successful successor state, struggled with the empire's legacy. The Kurdish population, denied recognition under the new nationalist ideology, mounted repeated rebellions. The memory of the Armenian genocide became a source of international tension, with Turkey refusing to acknowledge what happened and the Armenian diaspora demanding recognition and reparations. Ataturk's secular, westernizing project faced constant challenges from Islamic conservatives who saw it as a rejection of Turkey's true identity. The tension between secularism and Islam, between westernization and tradition, between Turkish nationalism and Islamic universalism has defined Turkish politics ever since. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the Ottoman collapse was psychological. For 6 centuries, the Ottoman Empire had provided a framework for understanding the world, a vision of universal Islamic rule that transcended ethnic and national divisions. Its collapse left a void that was never filled. The rise of political Islam in the 20th and 21st centuries can be seen in part as an attempt to recreate that lost unity. From the Muslim Brotherhood to ISIS, Islamist movements have dreamed of restoring the caliphate, of reuniting the Muslim world under a single banner. But these movements failed to grasp a crucial truth. The Ottoman Empire succeeded not because it was purely Islamic, but because it was pragmatic, tolerant, and adaptive. It incorporated the best of many civilizations, Byzantine, Persian, Arab, European, and created something new. The modern Middle East, divided into competing nation-states, has never achieved the stability and prosperity that the Ottoman Empire provided in its prime. The collapse of the empire unleashed forces, nationalism, sectarian strife, great power competition that continued to tear the region apart. The Arab Spring of 2011, which began with such hope and ended in such disappointment, can be seen as the latest chapter in the story of the Ottoman collapse. The artificial states created from the empire's ruins have struggled to establish legitimate governments, thriving economies, and stable societies. Syria has been torn apart by civil war. Iraq has been devastated by sectarian conflict. Libya has collapsed into chaos, and Yemen has been ravaged by proxy wars. The dream of Arab unity that inspired the revolts against Ottoman rule has been replaced by the nightmare of Arab division.
Lessons of decline, eternity, and adaptation. As we come to the end of our journey through the rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire, it is worth asking what lessons we can learn from this 600-year history. What does the collapse of one of the greatest empires in history tell us about power, about change, about human nature itself? First, it reminds us that nothing lasts forever. The Ottomans believed their empire was eternal, blessed by God, destined to last until the end of time. They called it the eternal state. They were wrong. All human institutions, however powerful or enduring they seem, carry within them the seeds of their own destruction. The very qualities that make an empire great, its size, its diversity, its complexity, eventually become sources of weakness. The Ottoman Empire fell not because of a single catastrophic event, but because of the slow accumulation of problems it could not solve. Military defeats, economic decline, administrative corruption, ideological confusion. Each problem compounded the others, creating a downward spiral that proved impossible to reverse. This is the fate of all empires, from Rome to Britain to the Soviet Union. They grow until they become too large to govern effectively, too diverse to hold together, too complex to reform. Success breeds the conditions for future failure. Second, the Ottoman story shows us the danger of falling behind. The empire's decline began when it stopped adapting, when it became rigid and conservative, while the world around it was changing rapidly. The scientific revolution, the age of exploration, the Industrial Revolution, all passed the Ottomans by, leaving them increasingly outdated. An empire that had once been at the forefront of military technology gradually fell behind its competitors. By the 19th century, Ottoman armies were using tactics and weapons that were centuries old. But the empire's reformers faced an insoluble dilemma. Every attempt at modernization threatened the traditional sources of Ottoman legitimacy. How do you reform an Islamic empire using European models? How do you create an Ottoman nationalism in a multi-ethnic empire? How do you modernize without losing your identity? The Young Turks tried to solve this dilemma through radical transformation, but their efforts only accelerated the empire's collapse. Sometimes, institutions may become so rigid that they cannot bend without breaking. The choice becomes not between reform and stagnation, but between transformation and destruction. Third, the Ottoman collapse reminds us of the power of ideas. The empire fell not just because of superior military force or economic pressure, but because of new ways of thinking about politics and identity. Nationalism, in particular, proved to be a solvent that broke down the bonds holding the multi-ethnic empire together. The Ottomans had created a system based on religious, not ethnic identity. Muslims, Christians, and Jews were separate communities, but they were all Ottoman subjects. This system worked for centuries, creating a surprisingly stable and tolerant society by the standards of its time. But it could not survive the rise of ethnic nationalism, the idea that every people must have its own state.
The tragedy is that the Ottoman vision of unity and diversity was, in many ways, more humane than the nationalist alternative. The empire, in its best times, was tolerant, cosmopolitan, and inclusive. Its collapse led to ethnic cleansing, genocide, and the creation of ethnically homogeneous nation-states that were often less tolerant than the empire they replaced. Fifth, the Ottoman story reminds us of the importance of legitimacy in politics. The empire lasted 6 centuries not just because of its military might or administrative efficiency, but because its subjects accepted its right to rule. That legitimacy was based on several sources: Islamic law, which gave the Sultan religious authority, military success, which proved God's favor, and practical benefits, which made Ottoman rule preferable to the alternatives. As long as these sources of legitimacy remained strong, the empire was stable. But when they began to weaken, when the empire started losing wars, when Islamic law seemed inadequate to modern challenges, when Ottoman rule became more burdensome than beneficial, the empire's legitimacy collapsed. No amount of force could compensate for the loss of popular acceptance. This is a lesson that applies to all governments, not just empires. Power based solely on force is inherently unstable. Durable political authority requires the consent of the governed.
The final transformation. Finally, the Ottoman story reminds us of the complexity of historical change. The collapse of the empire is not simply a tale of decline and fall, but of transformation and renewal. The Turkish Republic that arose from the ashes of the empire has, in many ways, been more successful than the empire itself. Turkey today is a modern, thriving, democratic country, something that would have been unimaginable under the Ottoman system. The painful process of imperial collapse and national revival, however traumatic it was at the time, was perhaps necessary for the Turkish people to realize their full potential. Similarly, the Arab peoples who gained independence from Ottoman rule have struggled to establish stable, prosperous societies. But they have also achieved what would have been impossible under the empire. They have developed their own national cultures, their own political systems, their own relationship with the wider world. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire was, in many ways, a tragedy. It led to wars, genocide, and decades of instability. But it also provided the framework for a new world. We cannot understand where we are without understanding where we came from. The British Empire is dead, but its ghosts still walk among us. They whisper in the languages we speak, in the laws we follow, in the institutions we inhabit. They remind us that all human endeavor is temporary, that all empires rise and fall, that the only constant in history is change itself. The sun finally set on the British Empire, but it rose on a new world that the empire helped to create. Whether that world will be better or worse than what came before is yet to be seen, but one thing is certain: the age of empire is over, and the age of something else has begun. The history of the Ottoman Empire is a story of human ambition and human folly, of great achievements and terrible crimes, of the rise and fall of civilizations. It is a story that reminds us of both the possibilities and the limitations of human power. In the end, perhaps this is the most important lesson of all, that no empire, however great, is eternal. Power is transient, but human history continues. The Ottoman Empire conquered the world, but the world eventually conquered the Ottoman Empire. And in that conquest, perhaps, lies the seed of a better future for all humanity. But it was also a liberation, a freeing of peoples to determine their own destinies and to build their own futures. History is not a simple story of progress or decline, but a complex process of change that involves both loss and gain, both destruction and creation. The end of the Ottoman Empire was not just an end, it was also a beginning. Today, if you walk through the streets of Istanbul,
you can still see the ghosts of the Ottoman Empire. The great mosques of Suleiman and Sultanahmet still dominate the skyline, their minarets reaching toward the sky like prayers turned to stone. The Topkapi Palace still looms over the Bosphorus, its courtyards and chambers echoing with the whispers of long-dead sultans and viziers. In the Grand Bazaar, you can still hear the voices of merchants from a dozen different lands, haggling in a dozen different languages for goods from across the world. The Galata Bridge still crosses the Golden Horn, connecting Europe and Asia, as it has for centuries. But the empire itself is gone, vanished, like the Byzantine Empire it replaced, like the countless other empires that have risen and fallen throughout human history. Its palaces are now museums, its mosques are tourist attractions, its borders are lines on old maps. The last Ottoman Sultan died in exile in 1944, forgotten and impoverished. The last Ottoman prince died in 1994, working as a librarian in New York City. The dynasty that once ruled half the world ended not with a bang, but with a quiet fade. However, something of the Ottoman spirit lives on in the cosmopolitan quarters of Istanbul, where Europeans and Asians, Muslims and Christians still live side by side. In the Turkish language, which still carries words borrowed from Arabic, Persian, Greek, and a dozen other languages. In Turkish cuisine, which blends the flavors from across the former empire. And perhaps most importantly, in the memory of what was possible. For 6 centuries, the Ottoman Empire showed that different peoples, different creeds, different cultures could live together under a single banner. It was not perfect, no human institution ever is, but in its best moments, it offered a vision of unity that transcended the narrow confines of tribe and nation. Lessons of unity and adaptation. That vision failed, shattered by the forces of nationalism, imperialism, and modernity. But the need for it remains in our interconnected world, where the challenges we face, climate change, pandemics, economic inequality, terrorism, transcend national borders. We need new forms of cooperation, new ways of thinking about identity and belonging. The Ottoman Empire cannot be restored, nor should it be. The world has moved on, and the conditions that made the empire possible no longer exist. But its memory reminds us that human beings are capable of creating institutions that are bigger than themselves, that serve purposes that transcend narrow self-interest. The empire fell, but the dream of unity, imperfect, fragile, but durable, lives on. In the European Union, which attempts to bring different peoples together under common institutions. In the United Nations, which attempts to provide a forum for global cooperation. In the countless international organizations that work to solve problems no single nation can solve alone. These modern institutions face many of the same challenges that destroyed the Ottoman Empire. How do you balance unity and diversity? How do you maintain legitimacy across different cultures and traditions? How do you adapt to changing circumstances without losing your core essence? The Ottoman experience provides no easy answers to these questions, but it does offer insight. It shows us that diversity can be a source of strength as well as weakness, that tolerance and pragmatism are more effective than ideology and rigidity, that institutions must evolve or die. It also reminds us that all human endeavor is temporary, that even the greatest empires eventually fall, that nothing we build will last forever. But this does not make the building less worthwhile. The Ottoman Empire lasted 6 centuries, longer than most nations. It left behind a legacy of art, architecture, literature, and law that enriches the world to this day. And so we come to the end of our story, the story of how a 600-year reign ended. The Ottoman Empire is gone, but its echoes still reverberate through the corridors of history, reminding us of what we lost, and, perhaps, of what we might yet build. The tree that grew from Osman's chest has withered and fallen,
but the seeds from that tree have scattered to the wind, and who knows where they may take root. History, in the end, is not only about endings, it is also about beginnings, and every ending, if we look closely enough, contains the promise of something new. The Ottoman Empire died, but from its ashes rose new nations, new ideas, new possibilities. The story of its collapse is also the story of the birth of the modern Middle East, with all its struggles and achievements. Perhaps this is the ultimate lesson of the Ottoman Empire, that even in failure, even in collapse, even in death, there can be renewal. The empire that called itself eternal proved to be mortal, but the human spirit that created it, the desire to build, to unite, to transcend the limitations of tribe and nation, that spirit is truly eternal. It lives on in every attempt to create something greater than ourselves, in every effort to bridge the divisions that separate us, in every dream of a better world. The Ottoman Empire is dead, but the dream that created it, the dream of unity and diversity, of justice and tolerance, of a world where different peoples can live together in peace, that dream will never die. And in that sense, perhaps the empire was eternal after all, not in its institutions or its borders, but in its ideals, not in its palaces or its armies, but in its vision of what humanity could become. The last sultan is gone. The last palace is empty. The last border is redrawn. But the dream lives on, waiting for new dreamers to give it shape, new builders to give it substance, new believers to give it life. The Ottoman Empire is dead. Long live the dream that created it. Sleep well, my listener, and may your dreams be of the eternal dream.